Emmanuel Macron tried to make Britain suffer for leaving the European Union. That's what Boris Johnson claims in his new book Unleashed. In this latest memoir, Johnson pulls no punches. He accuses the French president of weaponizing irregular migration to undermine Brexit. And according to Johnson, Macron was willing to turn a blind eye to the gang smuggling people across the English Channel. And the French president, he says, saw Brexit as a terrible insult to the European Union and to his worldview. And it seems, if you believe Johnson, that Macron was more than ready to give Britain a punishment beating for daring to leave the club. Johnson claims that Macron, whenever possible, would gleefully step on Brexit Britain, wearing his Cuban-heeled boots no less. Now, this isn't exactly surprising, given the frosty relationship these two leaders had. From disagreements on Brexit to arguments over fishing rights and even debates about the war in Ukraine, Johnson and Macron were often at odds. And when it came to Northern Ireland, Macron wasn't willing to budge. No renegotiation of Britain's post-Brexit deal. And Johnson portrays this stubbornness as yet another attempt by Macron to make Britain's life harder. In his book, Johnson also reveals some interesting behind-the-scenes drama. Apparently, David Cameron used a mix of threats and incentives to try to keep Johnson from backing Brexit. Cameron even offered a top cabinet job if Johnson would back the Remain side. But he didn't just offer carrots, there were also sticks. Cameron allegedly threatened to ruin Johnson forever if he chose to back Brexit. And clearly Johnson wasn't swayed. He went all in for Brexit, and yeah, the rest is history. But Johnson doesn't stop there. He takes aim at Cameron for what he describes as the former PM's flouncerama, a dramatic exit right after the Brexit vote. In Johnson's view, Cameron left the mess for others to clean up, petulantly, he says. And of course, he couldn't resist setting some other scores too. Michael Gove comes in for some criticism, especially for standing against Johnson during the Tory leadership race in 2016. You can almost hear the bitterness in his words. But let's go back to Macron and Brexit. So Johnson's view of the French president is not flattering. He paints Macron as an adversary determined to make an example of the UK to show other EU members what happens if you try to leave. It's a portrayal that fits into Johnson's broader narrative of the EU as an institution unwilling to let go and prepared to use any leverage it could find. And once again, let's go back to Northern Ireland here. Johnson suggests that fears of renewed violence were deliberately exaggerated to keep the UK bound to the EU. In his words, this was a trap, an attempt to make a nonsense of Brexit and make it impossible to deliver. He even goes as far as describing the EU's tactics as trying to see how long I could last. You get a sense of Johnson's frustration here. He portrays himself as the embattled leader trying to get the UK out of the EU while being constantly thwarted by both European leaders and the British establishment. According to Johnson, even the establishment in Britain combined with the EU to make Brexit as difficult as possible. And when it came to the risk of a new border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, Johnson argues that the EU and its allies cross-wired Brexit with a cause of peace in Northern Ireland. In doing so, they made it politically dangerous to push ahead with Brexit. This is classic Johnson, painting a picture of himself as the underdog battling powerful forces. But was Macron really trying to make Britain suffer, or was this just about defending European interest? Well, it's hard to say, especially when considering the history of tensions between the UK and France. The truth might be somewhere in the middle. Brexit was, after all, a fundamental challenge to the European Union, and as one of its key leaders, Macron would have had good reasons to defend the integrity of the EU. But Johnson's claims certainly add an extra layer of drama here. He talks about despairing of Macron, feeling frustrated at the constant roadblocks. And the accusations of weaponizing migration, that's a serious charge. Of course, Macron isn't here to give his side of the story, but we can imagine what he might say. Perhaps he would argue that the UK knew exactly what it was getting into with Brexit and that these challenges were simply consequences of the choices made. Johnson, however, prefers to see these actions as deliberate, almost vindictive moves against the UK. And what about Johnson's thoughts on his own leadership? Well, he argues that he would have won another election if he hadn't been forced out. Lockdown parties, he says, were blown out of proportion, and he insists he broke no rules. It's like a bit with Trump and the election. He claims he was the victim of a conspiracy, a ridiculous and unfair witch hunt driven by former advisors and the media. And Johnson doesn't hold back, calling out names, blaming Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain for feeding a media-driven campaign that forced him from office. And he insists that if he had stayed on, he would have led the Conservatives to victory in 2024. It's a bold claim, especially considering how divisive his leadership was. And yet, you can't deny the appeal Johnson had to a segment of the population. Why ever? His populist rhetoric and willingness to challenge the establishment certainly won him support. But whether that would have translated into another election victory, we'll never know. But I'm allowed to doubt that big time. The most controversial part of Johnson's book comes near the end, where he writes about the infamous number 10 lockdown parties. He argues that at the time he believed these events were in accordance with the rules and that his only mistake was to apologize. He calls his response groveling, something he clearly regrets. He portrays himself as the victim, targeted unfairly by his enemies. And he blames this fallout for condemning the Conservatives to defeat. It's clear that Johnson wants to set the record straight, to portray himself as a man who was wronged. And this book, Unleashed, feels like a cathartic exercise for him. But let's not forget the bigger picture here. Brexit was always going to be messy. The UK leaving the European Union was a seismic event, and the tensions between Johnson and Macron are just one small part of a much larger story. Johnson wants us to see Macron as a villain, but perhaps it's not that simple. Perhaps, like all political stories, it's about power, ambition, and competing visions for the future. Johnson's book gives us his side, but it's only one perspective. And with all things Brexit, the truth is a complex, messy, and ultimately a matter of perspective. So what do you think? Was Macron really out to make Britain suffer, or was he simply defending the EU's interest? Let me hear your thoughts, and you find the next video right here in the end screen.